Sonic X was one of the longest running Sonic television shows, clocking in at a total of 78 episodes, and honestly, it was a pretty interesting concept. Sonic and crew find themselves on Earth after a freak explosion, and they need to find a way back home. Along with Sonic and friends, there'd be a whole new cast of characters, such as this Sora lookalike named Chris, these things that you can't convince me aren't just the beta tests of Orbot and Cubot, and of course Rouge's totally platonic friend that would end up taking Rouge out on dates and would sob uncontrollably when Rouge had to return home.
That gem in the jewelry store, I had to get it for you. It was a steal. See ya.
Oh, and they also had this moment that was only in the Japanese dub. Now, if that wasn't enough Sonic X for you, well, the TV show actually produced a comic spin-off, aptly named Sonic X, which was published by Archie. I've often found this comic to be pretty fascinating, because despite the fact that it was initially supposed to only be a 4-part miniseries, it ended up getting more issues due to its popularity. Weirdly though, despite the popularity it had, I've never heard anyone talk about this. It's not uncommon to hear somebody say something like,
Archie Sonic was the strongest version of Sonic.
Or,
Fleetway Sonic is absolutely insane!
But where's the Sonic X comic fan saying, hey, remember that time Eggman stole 40 cakes, which is not only a terrible thing, but it's also just as many as 4 tens as was shown by Lex Luthor? As you can tell, tonally, these comics take a pretty big shift from traditional Archie stories, which can get pretty out there. These are often more lighthearted and comical, so imagine my surprise as a child when I stumbled upon issue 20 of Sonic X thinking that it was some kind of Archie Sonic comic that I had not heard about, in which Eggman dresses like a mechanic in a crop top in order to convince Sonic's rival Sam to use his car in order to race Sonic, only for said car to be actually some kind of transforming robot in disguise that definitely doesn't have robot genitals right there, don't look. It was probably a coincidence as well that this comic ended with an ad for the Transformers movie, totally unrelated to the story. Funnily enough, this wouldn't be the only time Eggman would dress up. There was also this other time that Eggman once dressed up as a famous Mexican wrestler named El Gran Gordo, and he would actually do this twice in the entire series. And while dressed up as this, he would face off against Sonic. In general, I actually think it's stuff like this that prevented the comic from being really remembered by anyone, because they lived simultaneously along with the Sonic X TV show, and essentially they were always in the TV show's shadow. They more or less had to follow what happened in the show, so things that happened in the show would directly impact things that were happening in the comics, but the comics could not affect things that were happening in the show. So oftentimes you had stories that would take place between arcs on the TV show, but at the end of the day, with the comic books, they would essentially not be able to make their own identity or explore any major arcs of their own, because ultimately things needed to be reset to the status quo without deviating too far away from the show. Effectively, this was essentially just one big Sonic X commercial, and it's a shame because there were some pretty good people on the team, such as Ian Flynn, who wrote the comics. So it could have been theoretically something really interesting if it could deviate just a little bit from the source material and make some of its own unique existence, instead of just attempting to coexist in the exact same world and not being able to have their own creative freedom. On top of that, following the story could actually prove to be a little bit difficult, as, like I said before, events from the TV show could be referenced or even directly impact characters in the comics, which essentially means that if you want to read the comics and really follow the story, you also have to follow the TV show around the same time to figure out what's going on. But here's something that's actually kind of interesting. This comic might have existed in a universe separated from the Archie Sonic stories, but it didn't prevent things from changing in the final issue, which was issue number 40. Essentially in this issue, it would actually lead to what would be the creation of Sonic Universe, which is wild. For those of you who don't know, Sonic Universe was actually a spin-off of the Archie Sonic comics, which essentially would take a look at different Archie Sonic characters and what they were doing in different stories that didn't directly involve Sonic. To understand this, we need to take a look at the Archie Sonic issue number 196, which we've actually seen before in a previous video. This takes place near the end of the Scourge arc. Super Scourge has defeated basically everyone, and Metal Sonic isn't making Sonic's life any easier. Thankfully, Shadow would then take Metal Sonic and use Chaos Control to warp the two of them away. Of course, if you want to know more about this, I have a video on this exact arc. But meanwhile, however, Shadow would accidentally teleport himself as well as Metal Sonic into the Sonic X universe, a universe where, at this moment, Shadow was actually presumed to be dead. Despite the dark undertone here, the story actually treats this kind of silly. Shadow crashes a tea party held by Sonic and Cream and Frickin' dog. Shadow crashes a tea party held by Sonic and Cream, and following this, Shadow explains everything to Sonic off-panel, and Sonic is just totally accepting of this whole thing. Heck, he's not even interested in hunting down Metal Sonic because I guess in this universe, trouble and bad guys just show up. This comic for sure has one of my favorite panels, which is right here when Shadow meets Sonic X's Vector, who thought that, of course, Shadow was dead like everybody else, and upon learning that, according to Sonic, he just got better, Vector is like, cool, and no other questions asked. I love it. Metal Sonic would end up teaming up with Eggman shortly after this, and the two of them would actually team up in order to take on Shadow and Sonic. But this fight literally lasts less than a page, and Shadow ends up using Metal again to teleport away. This ends with Sonic making a Sonic Adventure 2 reference of all things.
Sayonara, Shadow the Hedgehog.
And interestingly, also results in a frantic Eggman rushing back to his base in a panic as he scrambles to get into a secret room to reveal that Shadow, the Sonic X Shadow, was in fact alive in a stasis tube. This actually feels like the start of a really interesting story, but alas, this is exactly where the Sonic X comic ends. Shadow would teleport himself into what would end up becoming the very first issue of the Sonic Universe series, and almost fittingly, Sonic Universe would go on to take the crown from Sonic X as the longest running spin-off Sonic comic, which honestly very cool. These comics were something that was really interesting, and it was a neat little dive that I took into them. Honestly, I had no idea that they even ended up tying into the Prime Archie Sonic universe, and while I'm always down for something like that, like I mentioned before, it's pretty understandable as to why these might not be as remembered as, say, Archie Sonic or Fleetway. But it's pretty unfortunate that, unlike the Archie Sonic comics, they had such restrictions that kind of resulted in a lack of genuine storytelling, because there are moments in here, especially in the last issue, where it seems like there's a lot of heart being put into the stories, with some very fun writing. If you'd like to look into this weird comic, then please, of course, let me know if you want to see more stuff like this. If you feel like I might have missed anything or you want to add anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you feel like I earned any kind of like, subscribe, or anything like that, of course, I'd appreciate it, but ultimately, I just hope you have a good one.